What about Carter? Well, that's where the new documents are revealing. Turns out that Carter was an extreme hawk on this issue. It was known that he had sent a NATO general, Robert Heuser, to Iran for reasons that you could speculate about, but now we know because they're documented. The purpose was to encourage the Iranian military to act at once, to use force to put down the uprising and restore the dictatorship. That's Carter. Military wouldn't go along. They realized it's not going to work. They refused. Then the United States turned at once to supporting its friend Saddam Hussein, who was a friend, and who immediately attacked Iran. It was a bitter, brutal war. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians were killed using often chemical weapons, full support by the United States. The U.S. went so far as even to deny Saddam's merciless attack on Kurdish Iraqi civilians with the chemical warfare attacks in Halabja. Reagan claimed that Iran was responsible, which was ridiculous, and blocked congressional efforts even to issue a condemnation. Finally, the U.S. entered the war directly. Naval vessels supporting Iraqi shipping, protecting them from Iranian counter-reactions in the Gulf. Last thing that happened was a U.S. Destroyer, the USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian commercial airliner, killing 290 people in very clear commercial airspace. Vincennes finally went back to harbor, Norfolk, where it was the commander and the deck officer in charge of shooting down the plane were given medals of honor. Great. President Bush by then said he's never going to apologize for anything Americans do. The United States immediately turned. By then, the Iranians had basically capitulated. They recognized they can't fight the United States. We're now in the Bush administration. The Bush administration provided agricultural credits to its friend Saddam, which they needed after his merciless destruction of Iraqi agriculture with the chemical warfare attacks. I invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Very severe threat against Iran. Bush sent a delegation to his friend Saddam, headed by the leading Republican in Senate, Robert Dole, later presidential candidate. They were to present Bush's warm greetings to his friend Saddam, to inform him that he shouldn't be concerned about protests in the American press. We don't have any way to stop those because of this First Amendment business, but just disregard them. This is April 2000. A couple months later, Saddam disobeyed orders, invaded Kuwait. We know what happened after that. Meanwhile, harsh sanctions on Iran, continuing, never broken, continued all the way through into the Obama years. Obama finally recognized that Iran was increasing its development of centrifuges, moving forward on its nuclear programs it claimed for peaceful purposes, maybe correctly. He recognized that we got to do something, and he did agree to the JCPOA, which is described here as a very munificent act. So the JCPOA was established, then comes what I described. Now Biden is continuing to insist on U.S. violation of it, and by demanding a new agreement with harsher demands than this one, in violation of Security Council orders. The other countries object, but they can't do very much. And the sanctions continue. We saw a pretty remarkable power play about this. in the last weeks of the Trump administration. The UN sanctions, which the US had pretty much forced, were terminated, and the US wanted them to be renewed. Security Council was approached, refused to renew them. At that point, Secretary of State Pompeo returned to the Security Council and informed the Security Council, you are renewing the sanctions, period. Well, they don't like, it was almost unanimous opposition. Every U.S. ally opposed. But there's nothing they can do. As long as the United States controls the international financial system, it can impose harsh punishments on anyone who violates U.S. orders. We should notice, incidentally, that the United States is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions that have any bite. And it does it in an extraordinary way. This is an overwhelming use of economic warfare. And it's used, I mean, the chief main victim target is Cuba. Cuba has been under U.S. attack, unremitting U.S. attack, almost since the day of its independence in January 1959, within a few months. I don't have to go through the details, but it's a harsh, brutal regime. First, a major terrorist war under Kennedy almost led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost disaster. Then very harsh sanctions and very cruel ones. I mean, the cruelty is sometimes hard to believe. Like a couple of days ago, some documents were released which showed that the U.S. Government was trying to prevent Panama in the midst of a COVID crisis, try to prevent Panama from using the help of Cuban doctors. The savagery is so extreme that we must prevent Panama from accepting the internationalist assistance that Cuba is providing to other countries. Same document says the U.S. Embassy in Brazil pressured the Brazilian government to not to use Russian vaccines. Brazil's in desperate need of vaccines. It's a disaster in Brazil, well, maybe one of the worst in the world. But the U.S. Embassy has to try to pressure them not to use Russian vaccines, which are recognized by the medical profession to be as effective as the Western ones. It's a long article in the Lancet about it. But no effort must be spared to punish people who don't live up to our demands, no matter what it is. Smallest thing you can imagine, major things like the Iran sanctions. Now, we've talked about this before, but it's so important, I'll say it again. There is a solution, an easy solution to any possible threat that one might imagine Iranian nuclear programs pose. Can put aside the question whether there is such a threat. Let's pretend there is for the sake of argument. How do we end the threat? Easy. Impose a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. There are such zones around the world. Every one of them, if we look, cannot go in, not a single one can go into effect for one reason. The US refuses to remove nuclear bases. But they do exist and they're important. Could be one in the Middle East. It could be verification, can be very effective. We've seen that right through the period when the US adhered more or less to the JCPOA. Even US intelligence agrees verification measures were very effective. So that's not a problem. So what stops it? Is it the Arab states? They've been pressing for it vigorously for 25 years. Iran strongly favors it, is calling for it. The global south, the G77, so-called, about 130 or so countries, are strongly calling for it. There's no objections from Europe. There's one barrier, The United States won't permit it. Anytime it comes up in a relevant international forum, U.S. blocks it. Most recent was Obama, 2015, vetoed it at the review session of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why does the U.S. block it? Very obvious. The U.S. does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected. In fact, the United States does not recognize officially that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course, everyone knows that they do, including the US government, very substantial nuclear weapons, other chemical weapons, other facilities, but the US won't recognize it. And there's a good reason for that. If you recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons, US law comes into force. Symington Amendment, other legal provisions which raise the question, serious question, whether U.S. aid to Israel, the roughly $4 billion aid every year, whether that's even legal under U.S. law. Neither political party wants to open that door. There's no public pressure for it. So therefore, we refrain from carrying out a measure which could end any imaginable threat, if there is one, of Iranian nuclear weapons. Furthermore, the topic cannot be discussed in the United States. That's not literally true, of course. We're discussing it. Yes, I can give talks about it and so on, but it can't enter the mainstream. It is discussed in arms control circles, but can't enter the mainstream. This is because of the lack of popular movement, which is actively pressing this and many other similar issues. For example, on Israel-Palestine, there are other reasons, there are other steps that the U.S. isn't taking, but is legally required to take, which could have a big effect. Take, say, the Jewish National Fund. It has tax-free status. That is, its actions are subsidized by the American taxpayer. By various devious means, the JNF has been working in the occupied territories, illegally, of course. Now it's public. The JNF has publicly announced that it is going to work on development programs, support for settlements in the occupied territories, subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, thanks to its tax-free status. I think people in the United States ought to know that. They're saying that you, with your tax money, are subsidizing illegal activities, criminal activities that the U.S. government pretends to be opposed to. Well, people should know that, just as they should know that the U.S. is raising serious threats of war, very serious war in the Middle East, imposing brutal, savage sanctions, all in order to protect Israeli nuclear weapons from inspection and to protect the huge, unprecedented legal, U.S. taxpayer subsidized aid to Israel to prevent it from being questioned. These are things that should be right in the front of attention in the United States, and they won't be unless popular movements pick them up and push them. There's a lot more like this. This is the kind of, we're talking about activism. These are the kinds of things that should be front and center for activists concerned about the state of the world. Instead, we talk about whether Russia tried to help Trump in the last election. Who cares?